Good evening, everybody. Welcome and thank you for attending this evening. I feel like I've accidentally landed in this seat this evening, so you will have to bear with me. But I feel very privileged to sit here with some experience of my own, but really this evening is about the panel. So I'm just going to go quickly across the chairs here. So we've got Emily Stubbs, who's a ceramicist and founding member of Pica Studios. We have Dawn from Fabrication. Phil Bixby, who is an architect and director of YoCo, York co-owned. And we've also got Emma Coffield. I thought I'd get that wrong, but Coffield, from the University of Newcastle. To save listening to me too much, I'm going to pass you along the line to answer, well, just explain a little bit about yourselves. Couple of minutes just to introduce yourselves and explain why you're here.
Not quite sure. Let's just talk straight into it. Can everyone hear me all right? So my name's Emily Stubbs and I am a ceramicist. So I did a ceramics degree, graduating in 2008, and I've been in York practicing as a ceramicist since 2009. And I've worked in various locations, various studios, and eventually clubbed together with a few other local artists to create Pica Studios. And that's where I work from now. And there's 21 artists altogether, quite a mix, quite a motley crew of artists, and we've been there since 2017, so this is our 7th year really of being up and running. I also used to, as well, which might be relevant tonight, I also used to run Art and York, which was a 3-day large art event at York Racecourse as well, until the pandemic put an end to that. I'll pass you on now.
Thank you, Emily.
Down the road.
Hi, I'm Dawn. I'm CEO of Fabrication. We're a social enterprise that supports local artists and makers in Yorkshire with work and retail space. Personally, I'm a fashion designer, costume maker, and have been for a couple of centuries now. I lived in London and worked in film, theatre, many weird and wonderful things. And Fabrication started in Leeds. I live in Leeds, actually, and I'm a South Yorkshire, West Yorkshire, and now North Yorkshire gal. We set up so that myself and my husband would have somewhere to work when he moved up from London. I did clothing, he did metalwork and woodwork, and leatherwork, and there are art studios in Leeds but nowhere we could go, so we set our own up, and that's kind of been our story ongoing ever since. We set up retail space in Leeds. We set up in 2008, so we set up retail space then in 2011. We moved to York and we had a shop on Kearney Street from 2008, and then we moved to our bigger space, which is the River Island shop, in 2022. We have workspace in there as well, with a number of different types of makers in there. And we support about 120 makers, I think, in total across all our little bits.
Thank you, Dawn.
Hi, is this fun working too? Yeah, it is, amazing. I'm Phil Bixby. My role here this evening is that I was, along with Helen Graham, I devised and facilitated the public engagement process for the York Central site. And out of that process came an amazing public vision for what that part of the city could provide, which included all sorts of stuff around providing a hub for York's creative industries, about providing public space for people to be collectively creative, all sorts of wonderful stuff which largely didn't seem to find its way into the master plan or the outline planning consent for the site. So as a result of that, York Central co-owned, YoCo was set up to try and steward some of those good ideas onto the site. And so I'm part of YoCo and here this evening really kind of waving that particular flag.
Thank you, Phil. Emma.
Hi, I'm here because I was asked. I don't know anything about York, but I'm an academic. I work at Newcastle University. I teach curating art, but in my research time, I work a lot with grassroots arts groups, and specifically grassroots art groups who use meanwhile space. So we've done work for about 6 years with various colleagues in different departments, different universities, looking at the issue of meanwhile space and the kind of the reasons why people set it up, some of the problems they're encountering. And some of the stuff we've done there is trying to articulate value in varying ways in order to try and make cases for people to be able to stay for longer or to be able to get into buildings. We look at the safety of the buildings, the accessibility of the buildings, kind of real problematics around the physical spaces. We also look a lot at trying to foster relationships with policy and with councils to try and kind of build relationships there. We have lots of issues which we might want to get into, we might not. But trying to move towards something, because meanwhile space can be fantastic and it can be really, really useful, but also it can be shit. Meanwhile space, yes, absolutely. So meanwhile space is any kind of space. It could be for arts, it could be for a garden, it could be for retail, it could be anything that's used in between other more commercial uses. So it could be an office building, it could be like a little pop-up space, it could be a garden, art centre, whatever you use the space for, but it's in between those more commercial uses. And generally leases are somewhere between. It could be a weekend, 6 months, 5 years if you're lucky, 20 if you've won the arts lottery. And we're trying to push for longer and longer leases or alternatives to meanwhile space to be on the table as well as, because they can work really well, but also they can be really terrible, and they can entrench equality, and they can entrench really difficult working conditions and precarity for artists. And we're trying to find a way of articulating that, and I've got some reports, free to steal, and also changing it.
Great. Thank you very much, Dawn. And just for context, although Chris kindly introduced me as the Master of the Guild of Media Arts, I also run a design agency in the city of York, and I have done since 2008. Out of that, I've been involved in the creative and digital sector for some time. More recently, set up York Design Week out of a space above Brew York and their beer hall, and we now run a co-working space as a CIC. And are involved in other things as well. So, just for a little bit of context, that hopefully helps you why I'm kind of sat here, because I have a bit of knowledge and understanding of the city as well. So, first question is to Phil, Emily and Dawn, so I'm not excluding you, Emma. What was the provision like when you started your career, either in York or potentially Leeds or London, whether you can bring some insight to that question. So starting with Emily, please.
Okay. When I graduated, I moved back home to Holmfirth in West Yorkshire. So if any of you know Last of the Summer Wine, that village. Are you from Huddersfield? Well, there we go. Fellow Hoodite with me. And I've got to say, in West Yorkshire, especially that area, Kirklees Council were fantastic at that time. And, it's an old woolen mill kind of area. So there were a lot of these old industrial mills just sat going empty. And that actually was really good for the creative kind of sector, because artists would happily go and use those spaces. They were cold, freezing cold, even in this sort of weather, absolutely bitter cold. But they were kind of plentiful and accessible, and it didn't take a lot of kind of coercing a mill owner to let artists just move in and use the space. So I was really spoilt in that first year, moving back to Holmfirth, where I had, a space probably about the quarter of this room for pennies a month, and it was amazing. And I thought, great, this is what creative life is like everywhere. And then I moved to York and was absolutely disappointed with what was on offer here. I didn't feel like there was anywhere that I could rent affordably. I lived out in Stamford Bridge, and at that time my partner was working in Leeds, so I ended up going over to Leeds and getting a space with E Street Arts, which have been going 30 years, they must be now. And so for a few years, I commuted from York to Leeds to a studio space there because there just wasn't anything here on offer. Then around 2017, I'd been kind of in and out of different spaces, working from home for a lot of that time, which with ceramics isn't ideal. A lot of dust everywhere. Plus I have cats, so it just gets even further. And I had quite a lot of friends who were in a similar position, either working from ridiculous tiny little spaces or from kitchen tables, and that stop-starting creativity isn't good. So having to get your work out and then at the end of the day pack it up again was just really not conducive to, you know, creativity at all. And so there was about 8 of us, the core group, that set Pica up. And that came out of necessity. That came out of a group of us all complaining about the lack of affordable space and coming together to, basically we sat in the pub and worked out what we could all afford per month, and then had a look around, realised the commercial lets were astronomical. But it was a lot of luck. We had one of our group knew the printers at Quacks. They'd recently gone digital, and so their entire bottom floor on Great Plain, which had these amazing printing presses, was being stripped out. And obviously it was a creative working space, so they couldn't, well, they would have to do a lot of work to get it up to scratch to rent out commercially to like a clothes shop or something. Whereas for artists, we walked in and, you know, there was a tiled floor, a few broken tiles, we don't care. The walls were painted white and that was it. We were smitten. And they did a really good rent for the first 3 years. We signed a lease with them at, you know, what we could afford. And then gradually we built that up and they've increased the rent, but we can still meet it. So that's how we got started. So it was disappointing, but then there are people here to make it happen.
Thank you, Emily. Really good, and please keep talking because I think everyone will learn something this evening. I'm already learning something, which is great. And I'll hopefully pick up a few things that people are saying as we go. So, Dawn, do you mind?
So, I'm a little older, and when I graduated in 1979, there wasn't a great deal in Huddersfield. So it was all working from home from the kitchen table. And then I went to London and worked in various places down there, but again, mainly from the kitchen table.
Can I ask whereabouts in London?
I lived many places in London. Started in Barnet because it was the closest place to Yorkshire I could find. Ended up in the city. Lived in Richmond for a bit and heading all over. I had a little shop in Chiswick High Street for a while, which I used as a workspace because my late husband, he was a friend with a guy whose family owned it, so we had downstairs and, you know, we'd have, I did a lot of Darcy bridegrooms one year for the, you know, for a certain reason, that kind of thing. And yeah, but I always remember, well, like when I'm from being of the age of about 10, what do you want to be when you grow up? I'm going to win the pools. I'm going to have a shop like Harrods for all my friends who make things, because all my friends are going to be able to make things. And there you go. I'm going to have a shop on Brigger and I'm going to have a shop in York. Took rather a long time, but we're here. And again, with no money. So moved back to Yorkshire 2002 and again worked from home. And then my late husband moved up in 2008. But we couldn't both do what we did in my little tiny flat, little council flat. So we looked at getting somewhere. But East Street Arts wouldn't take us because they don't take textiles and they don't do flame with jewellery, which his work was very specialist, court livery buttons, that kind of things all over the TV yesterday, in odd little ways, and very specialist stuff. So we couldn't be part of them. There was no space, so we had to find our own. And I found a dilapidated little building around a little back alley in the centre of Leeds, and I managed to get a little unlimited award of £5,000, and which basically went on deposit and some equipment. Up to that point, even though I've made clothing for years, I mainly hand sew or I use domestic. I've never had an industrial machine, never had a table to cut, and it's always been the floor. like many people I know, if I worked on films with a lot of other costume makers that I know, we would hire a hall like this, go in for 3 days, get beer and pizzas as well, and talk to each other, because this is before the days of the internet for a start. And one of the big remits of fabrication actually is to stop isolation amongst craftspeople. That's as big a part of it as having workspace. So within our shop, everyone has to work because we know you're okay, or we can help you, or whatever. Because everybody I knew had a chocolate or cigarette habit, because at 3 o'clock, you needed to go and speak to the man behind the counter across the road, because that was your only human contact. We didn't have mobile phones in them old days, or, or couldn't procrastinate on Facebook. So I come from it from that very long, road of doing this, really. And we've always said, with our kind of story of how we work, we're not the coolest place you'll ever be, but we're the coldest place you'll ever work in. Because again, that was a little scabby 18th century. It's been a milliners and a shoemakers in the 18th century found out. I like to read about where I am and know my place in that crafts history. And so I always do a bit of research about whatever building we take on, which led us to do the Coney Street Heritage Project as well. And we moved out of there because there was a fire in a little tumble-down 18th century building next door back in 2017. And then we took on a 7,000 square foot workspace slap bang in the city centre.
This was in Leeds?
This is in Leeds. And one of the reasons why I wanted to be in the city centre was safety, bus routes, cars. My husband didn't drive because he lived in London all that time, so you need to be on a bus route, so I didn't have to pick him up. We have a lot of females in the buildings, and they would come and work at night, because the beauty is that you work the hours you can do outside your day job. So we always wanted to be somewhere where there were cabs and buses, and we managed to get a lot of buildings in the centre of Leeds had been locked down for the John Lewis project, and then were being released. And we managed to get an old industrial warehouse for a very short term until they could knock it down. And we moved in 2017. I'm still there, although we're on a bit of a knife edge, because we can compare with what's happening in other cities being there. You think you've got it bad in York. In the last 6 months, six creative workspaces in Leeds have had their eviction notices. That's 300 creative businesses with nowhere to go because the shiny is coming in. And this is one of my things, and I will say, and I said it actually at the York bid last week as well to people. Creative industries are dirty. We're not just clean office spaces. I had to move to somewhere when the fire was next door, because we had to move because part of my upstairs. We discovered in that beautiful way of 18th century building, no foundations and over a ginnel. So when you took that building down, it was a little bit like a Roadrunner cartoon. And it took me about 2 weeks to get the pins and the threads out of the white boucle carpet. When I had to leave there, and it was isolated. So we have this, but the last iteration was a Chinese supermarket. Actually, the last iteration was a cannabis factory. But before that was a Chinese supermarket. The fridges came in really handy for hydroponics. We found quite a few little things in corners as well.
Dawn, I'm not going to be able to keep up with you tonight, I don't think.
But this is the reality, isn't it, of when you take on a building. So we also walked in and went, this is a dump. There's a tiled floor. You can burn gas torches there. It won't matter. I can spill dye over there. We can do woodwork there. And then you can take it on, and then you build it from that.
So just quickly, in York specifically, obviously you've had a decent chunk of time in fabrication on Coney Street. Honestly, I've never been, so apologies.
Dare you?
But I've seen some great pictures.
What, this week?
Yeah, today. So one of the projects that I've been doing with Ben is mapping, and Chris and others in the city is mapping these spaces in York and highlighting the range and variety. So seeing those pictures today really opened my eyes, because I'd been in River Island some time ago. But obviously you've been in there now. How long are you going to be in there for? You were mentioning just before.
Well, yes. So we moved into York in 2018. We had a little tiny shop on Coney Street. The National Trust have just been doing it up. We were lucky enough to take on River Island in May 2022. Because it had the 3 floors, it meant that we could do in York what we were doing in Leeds, but in one building. We were separated in Leeds. And so we set about turning the upstairs into an exhibition space. Everything we do is affordable. It has to be affordable. You rent a unit for £35 a week to sell your stuff on Coney Street, and it's the same with the exhibition space. We've got changing rooms, we've got partitions, so it becomes a hot desk. I look at everything in that context. So we have a number of permanent tenants. We've got candle maker, Wendy, just down there, actually runs our upstairs spaces. Is a candle maker. We have costume makers, we have artists, and that. We've got a photography studio, which you can use an hour, whatever. So you can come in a hot desk, or you can take a permanent space. We are there until January because of the Coney Street Riverside project. We were lucky enough to be the top bid for the SPF for 500k to set up a creative work area in York. And we were 2 points off getting the money because we couldn't sign a lease until we knew we got it. We had an area already designated to take on. And we couldn't take it on. They wouldn't give us the money without us having a lease. And we couldn't sign a lease until we got the money. But we were ready to sign it as soon as they said yes, but they wouldn't do it the other way around. And we had people fighting. So we know the powers that be want it. We were the best bid for it to take on 50,000 square foot of space to do this for mixed of everything. But you reel it in, you go back. We've put an offer in on another building in the city centre where we should be able to get 50 workspaces.
Fantastic.
As well as exhibition space and photography and a bigger shop and.
Good. I'm going to pause you there.
Do. Because I'm not telling you any more on that one. But
It's a good place to pause and just bring Phil in. Phil, I'm just going to highlight to some people in the room that you are award-winning.
No!
3 awards.
3.
Congratulations on your recent wins for York Design Awards.
Thank you.
For architecture in the city. But it is also your home.
It is also my home, which is really my story, I guess, which is rather shorter. But it's I qualified around about exactly the same time as you. So back then, what I very quickly discovered as an architect is that I make a really terrible employee, and I also would make a really terrible employer, which basically commits me to just being self-employed for the entire duration of my life, which is what I've been. So as an architect, we're very lucky in many ways in that we can, you can basically run out of a corner of a room if you want to, which is largely what I've done through my life. So I haven't had that kind of same issue about, the search for premises to run my business from. But what I have seen, I've been looking across in front of Owen there at that, York's lost creative spaces. Having lived in York for more than 30 years, I've kind of seen all them disappear and more, and seen what the effect has been on a city which, on the face of it, for many people is seen as being a success story. York's economically vibrant, there's lots of wealth around, blah, blah, blah. It's all wonderful, isn't it? But there is a side to that, which is about the inequality we have in the city, and finding myself now in the position where personally I'm in this kind of happy situation of having this, as Owen has horribly pointed out, award-winning office and home, which I can then work from and live in. But on the other hand, working in a place which is deeply malfunctioning in terms of what it offers to the people of the city as a whole. And I guess what that then leaves me as an architect, and particularly with my involvement with public engagement and trying to help the city develop a vision for what it wants to be, is really taking that issue seriously and looking at where the opportunities are to do things. Well, I think it's interesting about the fact that we don't have a city full of disused warehouse buildings with lots of space in. We have a very specific problem here, which is about we have to think about the kind of buildings we do have, and where we do have opportunities, 45 hectares of York Central, what are we going to build there, and how is that genuinely going to work with the creative people within the city to develop the wonderful stuff that's going on at the moment, rather than simply turning into something which is seen as being investment driven.
Thank you, Phil. I'm going to ask you a little bit more about YoCo in a minute.
Cool.
But Emma, you must have heard similar stories that three people here have quite eloquently explained and over quite a serious amount of time, not just in York. Can you maybe open that up a little bit more broadly across your research, specifically meanwhile use, because it's obviously quite a big thing that does happen across cities, but maybe has struggled in York, I think, to actually happen.
Yes, I think the idea of lack is really clear in almost everybody's story. Almost every meanwhile space comes out of that. There is nowhere for me in my work. And that's why there is that kind of momentum to find something, but then the luck as well, and the connection. And for some people, that just doesn't come. So we talk to people for whom they are still looking for that, it's still not there. They can't find it, and the impact that not having a space or losing your space has on you. We hear that kind of story a lot. And often it does rely on those really chance encounters or having a friend that has nothing to do with the arts, but suddenly is like, oh, by the way, do you know that my dad? And you're like, give me the space, give me the space. So we hear that a lot. That's like a really repetitive thing. I think what we also hear that I really heard in all of your accounts there is what a terrible state some of the spaces are in. They're cold. We have spaces without windows a lot. They're almost always freezing cold. Toilets, like basic provisions. And that's before you get anywhere near things like accessibility. And who that can then use that space. So we have a real problem, I think, maybe similar to the one you have, in that we have listed buildings. So all the empty space is there, but it's up at the top. And because the buildings are listed, the developers that own them don't have to pay for the tax anyway, so then you can't make the same kinds of arguments to get into those spaces. So you end up with these kind of the ground floor shops and there's just nothing, there's wasted space. But how do you make that space accessible? How do you make sure that the people who can get into that, everyone can get into that building? What happens if you are a disabled artist? Where does your practice go? What happens if you have equipment like kilns? Kilns is always the one that comes up, but I can see the cutting table as well. Oh, yeah. The space to be able to afford to do things, not afford in the kind of financial sense, although that is obviously, affordability is a huge factor. Traveling in, what about people who are parents, who are carers, who don't have time to travel 2 hours that way to a warehouse and 2 hours back again? So we look a lot at who can't get in, where that waste is as well. You talked about so many different spaces and moving all the time, but that's enormous amount of time that's wasted, of work that's wasted, the energy and the motion that goes into making those spaces to have them kind of taken away at such short notice. I think sometimes the artists we're talking to, they use exhaustion as a kind of code. And exhaustion can mean anything from I've had a really bad day to I can't do this anymore. Like we talk artists, I'm just so exhausted, I cannot move. If we get, if they pull the space, that's it. I'm going to go and do something else because it is so precarious, and the impact that has on people's health and their own well-being. And the idea that to have a creative career, you have to suffer somehow, you have to sit in the cold. No, you don't. You don't have to sit in the cold. And there are other industries that look at the spaces that I know are being offered to artists. And I went to a business incubator event and they laughed at the idea that they would go in there. They laughed at that. But it was being touted to artists and creative, artists in the very broadest sense. As that, that you've got a tiled floor and you've got some windows, be grateful. And I think that says a lot. And you are, but it says a lot. It says a lot about how the arts and artists have been treated, I think, historically, and the value that is placed on that. And that thing about what is a meanwhile space. You only get the space until something better comes along, and then you are out immediately with 2 weeks' notice. So I think that there are ways of perhaps building in protecting mechanisms to support people, and so that they can feel, if they find a space that is their home, that they've worked so hard for over so many years, that is protected and it is stable, and it allows artists to live stable creative lives and the kinds of things that they would be able to do if they weren't moving every 5 minutes and moving a heater around and doing all of those things.
Great. Thank you, Emma. It sounds like there can be huge disparity within the sector and the fringes of the sector, because I think we say about creatives, but also then it can turn into technology, digital, other crossover sectors as well, and almost owning the creative makerspace sometimes can be quite conflicting, because actually, you want footfall, you want people to buy your things, then it becomes commercial, and there are a lot of other grey areas that I've experienced, but also hear from people within the city, but obviously further afield as well. I think it's interesting from my experience down in Bristol in particular, the paintworks was it was a chemical nightmare down by the river, and that's now become regenerated. It's very exciting, but it's gone the other way. It's not had a stepping stone approach. It's actually gone truly to commercial truly commercial rental. Nobody can buy the spaces. It's architects, designers, things like that. So, or lawyers wanting a nice, cool space. So I think in terms of opportunity, it's interesting to flip to Phil and maybe come back this way about York Central. And I was talking to Helen Marriage a couple of weeks ago and very much talking about a brownfield site. And I think it's now, in terms of terminology, very much a regeneration space, which I think is definitely happening. There's a lot of groundworks happening. This is springboarded out of consultation and obviously a lot of planning, but it's great to see things happening finally. Can you explain a little bit about YoCo in more detail, please, Phil? And the Foundry building, I think, is something that you can talk about.
So YoCo, as I kind of said earlier, YoCo came out of an event that we did during York Design Week back in 2019, and asking the question, were there people out there who wanted to steward the good ideas from the public vision for the site actually onto the site? And some of the people in this room are involved with it, and it's a mixed group. I think, so one of the things that was central to YoCo setting up was the kind of loudest message that came out of the public vision for the site was about affordable homes. People wanted affordable homes, what they called forever affordable homes. People wanted housing on York Central that was about providing homes for people rather than providing lucrative investments for people. So there was a focus upon people wanting to live on York Central, and as the scheme developed and as the kind of numbers started to become apparent, so the proposals for 2,500 or more new homes on York Central, how do we try and make sure that that ends up as being something where there are genuine opportunities for local people, rather than 500 affordable, inverted commas, affordable homes and 2,000 Airbnbs? So that kind of drove YoCo in terms of trying to think of ways we might be able to try and push for more affordable homes on the site. But we started also asking questions around what kind of place people wanted York Central to be. And people talked about wanting to be able to hear birdsong outside their window, and wanting streets that children could play in. They wanted streets that were tree-lined. They wanted outdoor space that was humane and that they could have some ownership of. And so we started asking questions about what it takes to be able to create that kind of part of the city. And it's incredibly complicated. It's not just about, creating streets that kids can play in is not just about getting rid of cars, but it's about how do you create a bit of city which feels safe. So we started asking questions about what kind of stuff do we want at street level? What kind of economy encourages people to do stuff at street level where people walk to them, people ride bikes to them, people kind of pop in and out? How do we create bits of the city which people could take ownership of outdoor space? So you could have a business in a shop front or whatever, but you can move out of that and do stuff outdoors. And so that whole business about what kind of businesses work well in that situation, and we thought, well, it's small, granular stuff. It's people that live locally and take ownership of the place. It's about people who have a knowledge of and a wish to share, to serve the local community. And that's very much got us starting to think about, how do we create opportunities for small business, for business startups, for creative people, and make places which work for them, so it makes places which work for everybody. You mentioned, Owen, the foundry buildings. So yes, I mean York Central, as I say, it doesn't have a stack of knackered old warehouses that we can take over. The only two buildings which look as if they're going to stand a chance of survival are the two original foundry buildings, which some of you may know, just off Lehman Road, just out past the St Peter's Quarter. They were used by Autohorn as part of their car rental business until they got shifted out a few years back, and are now standing empty. So yes, we've been very much leaning upon Helen Marriage to kind of say, how can we turn these into something which provides opportunity? We ran a workshop earlier in the year with the artists and makers from YoCo Studios, just to start kind of thinking, what might a brief look like for that building, which would be about creative space, which would be about flexibility, which would be about providing a place which works for creative professionals, but also works for the community, so that, ideas around makerspace proposals where there would be stuff there that people could use in their work, but people could also rent space and rent time and rent use of. We very much kind of took the view that rather than sitting around and waiting for £1 million worth of grant to turn up to repair all the stuff that needed to be repaired, we needed to think about how do we create economic activity on York Central which makes it worthwhile doing that kind of stuff to those buildings. So that's very much where we are at the moment, which is pushing for a pilot community-led development which incorporates small-scale commercial, cultural, social stuff at ground floor, but also looking at the two existing buildings on the site and trying to look at how we develop a business plan which turns them into something that works for your creative people.
Great. Thank you very much, Phil. I think you've mentioned numerous things there that we can focus in on. I am going to come back this way, Dawn. So I've just written down scalability, and I think it's interesting. We've got a number of examples that we can highlight within the city, fabrication being one of them and Pica being another, but also expanding that out to projects that are still ongoing and being talked about and being worked on, like Spark, for example, and a bigger sense of meanwhile use of space and land, but also challenges that we have, for example, in space, where we've got a superior landlord, we've got a lease from another business, so we're sub-leasing, we're caretakers of a space, but we're not really allowed to do anything with it. Dawn, it sounds like there's been some very fraught things that have happened, fires included. But scalability, I think, is, and I think that's the thing. There is a challenge there, but it feels that within the city, people are wanting to look for solutions and definitely take on those challenges. But in terms of how you've developed, I suppose, that scalability, because fabrication currently on Coney Street is pretty big. There might be you may have to downsize. You may also, as you've highlighted, be looking at a bigger space.
Yeah.
So could you talk a little bit about that and how you've dealt with that across your experiences?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of kind of retail, to go back to before we moved to York, really, which is how we could do York. We had a little, again, grubby shop on Kirkgate that was very damp, and you didn't really want to go to the loo because you thought the floor might go through, but we could vaguely afford it. And then we got somewhere at the back of the Merrion Centre, and we closed on Saturdays because the council offices weren't open, so it wasn't worth opening. And then, by sheer chance, we got a meanwhile use space in the old confetti shop in the Light in Leeds. Which was 3,000 square foot, and I suddenly had 90 sellers in there. I was going, we've just got the Light. Anybody want to come in? You want to sell? We've got it for a week. We went for a week. I was there 6 weeks short of 6 years. I don't like to move because you accumulate stuff. It's going to cost me 20 grand to move out of that workspace in Leeds. We need to buy it. I need to stay there. So we took the chance and we managed to move rates around and things like that. And we turned it into this amazing space for lots of makers. And because we had the workspace as well, we had the two, we could support both, but we also did making and teaching and things because we had a big shop to fill. And it started to generate a bit of money, which then paid for a bit of this and a bit of that. And then we took on this giant workshop because the shop could pay for the bit. But I remember sitting on the floor in the giant workshop trying to clean it and getting, going, what on earth have I just committed us to? And just crying and going, you really need to learn to say no, Dawn. You really need to learn your limitations. You're getting on a bit, it's hard work, we're never going to fill this place, we're never going to be able to pay the bills. And then COVID hits. And you go, okay, so that the money stream to pay this, that then creates space for suddenly goes, so what do you do as well? So it's all those little things when there's no safety net, and it's not just your business that's going, it's many other people's businesses that are going. Getting like the old scabby buildings that have been knocked down in Leeds for the shiny. 300 creative businesses have now nowhere to go, and we're in that same position in the centre of Leeds. We are, say, in what was the Hammersons, John Lewis area, they now just have that bit, but it's the only bit of scabby left an area in Leeds that hasn't got a high-rise student flat on it. That's what they want to do, so we're next, and what then do you do? So I don't have any answers. I'm afraid that's just how we limp forward, but you have to move. And because we were only, meanwhile, in that building, it was only 18 months in 2017. I'm still there. And we accumulate more stuff, and then you go, God, if we've got to move, where, how, what we're going to do. But in that meanwhile, you have to go for it. When we took on River Island, it was that chance to do that and to show, again, I do quite a lot of talking around what is the high street now, and that community and the arts and creativity and caring and kindness and things on the high street and old-fashioned bits of the high street. And I do some speaking, talking to people with the Institute of Place Management and stuff around creatives. And we are seen as a model that's worked because we've gone from that scabby pop-up to a 10-year lease on Brugger. We will take a 10-year lease in York when we move. That's the plan. So that we do have a legacy and we don't have to just keep moving, because the core of us from 2008 and 2011 are now getting on a bit, and it's like, this is our last shop build. I'm doing no more now. This is it. It's hard work. We moved in Leeds last year, because a lot of the city has moved from the centre, and that is one of my concerns with York Central. I've moved down to places like Whitehall, and the office have moved. So the lunchtime economy still hasn't come back post-COVID because the offices have moved, particularly legal, and it, is a concern. So we moved to close to the centre, and we were like, how do we put these up so well? It's like, cause we didn't think we'd be the ones taking them down. We wanted to move in 10 years. We've moved in 5, And it is all those bits. I do find myself watching how a city operates a lot.
That's a really interesting thing. I think Helen and the team and the wider stakeholders are obviously looking into this, and they have been from consultation and being privy to a number of conversations. There is that cultural attention that has been made between the city of York old, not really old in terms of heritage, but just as its current form, and then how does that link? And obviously the train station is going to be really key. Certain buildings that hopefully will be maintained, I think, are also included in that vision. But it's connecting to community. It's making sure that it's not just completely new and bringing in departments or housing, but it's mixed use. It is from the ground level, and it's going to be relevant for the communities that already exist. And I think that segue there into the Pica community. You've got a really amazing space. I have been into Pica. Sorry, Dawn.
Good.
Shopping tomorrow.
Yeah, I will. Honest.
I won't be there, to be honest.
Yeah. Get a clip around the ear. So Pica is quite compact. It's small. It's kind of a bit like York in terms of its compactness. You've got some incredibly talented individuals, as Dawn has in terms of other spaces in and around York. Incredibly talented people. Equally, those people who also work from home, who we may not have even met yet, which is something maybe we might be able to talk about. But you've had a consistency, perhaps, around the people and the members of Pica. Is that right? And does that affect your attitude to the space?
Massively, yeah, it does. And I think exactly what everyone's been saying here. A creative space is a culture in its own self. It's, this kind of like boiling pot of creativity. Pica is, we've not got any kind of restrictions on, other than space, on who can be part of Pica. And so we've got, our community is made up of really professional, long-term artists who are very, very far down in their career. We've got someone like Mark Hurld, who is, in Japan next month doing some prints. He was in Paris last year doing prints for handbags and, the sculpture pack here, there and everywhere. And then we've got some people who, like Ray, Ben's partner, who has just done her master's. So she's very much in the beginning of her artistic career. And then we've got everyone in between. And I think that's the beauty of somewhere like that, is it brings a community of creative people together, all at different points in their careers, in their journeys, and that just kind of, it grows and everyone works together. If you come to Pica, you'll notice we don't have any walls. There's the odd wall, that's it. So everyone is on top of each other. We have our spaces, but you have to get used to being able to work in front of people quite quickly, and it doesn't suit everyone. That's not, we have had a couple of artists who have come and it's just not been for them, and they've left. But we do find that in the 7 years we've been there, we've got this core group that are very consistent, and they're in every day, or at least 3 times to 4 times a week working. And I think that's what annoys me with the view of artists as an industry being quite flaky, because actually all artists want to do is have a space, and we don't ever want to move, ever. And
eat.
Oh, yeah. And I had spaces through Blank Canvas. I don't know if they're still going. And that was always these temporary locations that were, I was in this weirdly stately home down Tadcaster Road, which used to be a doctor's surgery, and then it was going to be redeveloped into flats. And that time limit of going from one industry, turning into another through planning permission, they said, it could take 6 months, but it might take 2 years. So we had this, we all had these spaces for, I think it was like £50 a month. Great, so cheap, very, very good. But you move all your stuff in, and clay weighs a ton, 12.5 kilograms per bag. And it's that's a lot of shifting, a lot of weight. And, the kiln, I didn't even attempt to take a kiln there. I kept that in my shed at home. But all these artists put all this time and effort and energy into making a space their own. And then to be on that eggshell of when's this going to fall apart? When are we going to, and it was 2 week notice, so when are we going to have 2 weeks to get out? If you're on holiday, what are you going to do? You've got to, you might have just left to go on holiday for 2 weeks, and you're having to ask your friend or your sister to move you out, and, it's stressful, and it's not conducive to creativity at all. That it doesn't allow for someone to really enjoy being in a space and grow with a space. And I think that's what we found at Pica, is that actually if you offer a space and the demand is there, people stay, and we are very reliable and consistent, and you'll probably have to tear us screaming from the building before we leave. So I think that's what annoys me about spaces that become available, is that they see artists, it seems like artists are seen as the stopgap in between the more serious business that'll move in. So, yeah, that's what I've found.
Thank you.
That's okay.
I'm going to go back over to Emma to follow this on, because I think there are things that have been mentioned around seriousness, commitment, application of, or how do you apply your skills? And some very highly skilled people are in the creative industries and are world famous. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be in the spotlight, but they are highly talented and are in York and the surrounds. But that must be common in other cities. Clearly, we are lucky in York to have some amazing stakeholders, 2 universities, York St John, University of York. We've also got the college, obviously down the road. They provide a platform for students and people to learn and knowledge exchange, all sorts of great things, and they have spaces as well. Some of them are springboard spaces, but also we've found in York with the Guildhall in particular, where it was destined for creative and digital, has maybe become more commercial. Can you shed a bit of insight and light from your kind of academic university viewpoint, but also maybe having all of that knowledge that you've garnered from meanwhile use? And just comment a few things around that, Emma.
Not 100% sure on the question.
Yeah, I'm not either. I was just rambling a little bit and looking at you, hoping you'd pick up on
I know
something.
why the university finds this interesting, and it's graduate retention is the horrible, horrible phrase that is used. And if we use that phrase, we get funding to work with artists. I don't know how that works in cities like York, and potentially in Durham is the one that we work with, where there aren't creative practice degrees, because we can make an argument immediately. I work with curators, I work with artists of all different kinds. We have a responsibility to them. I'm not supposed to call them my kids, but I'm really invested in their careers and their lives, and I want them to lead good lives, and I don't want to be teaching them thinking, oh, God, what are they going to do? Where are they going to go? I don't want to have loads of people graduating into an industry where they're going to be deeply precarious, where they don't have that stability. And you talked about artists having that reputation as being flaky. And that comes up a lot sometimes with studio provision. But only 3% of artists in an Arts Council England report recently make enough money from their practice not to have another job. So the reason they're not in the studio all the time is because they are working. And that's got worse and worse and worse recently, because obviously we've got a cost of living crisis and everything costs more, including your studio. And if you're also then paying nursery fees, I mean, where do you even start? So I think from a university perspective, some of the arguments that we have used are that we have a responsibility to our graduates. We also have a responsibility as a university that brands itself as civic. The community angle, what is the point in having a university there as an ivory tower? No academic that I like thinks like that at all. We all want to be useful, we're all interested in people, we want that information to come out and to be porous, and we want to be there to support. All the projects that I have worked on and worked with others on, it's there as an additional resource. It's a way of facilitating something to happen because we know how under-resourced artists are. And that's why I work with grassroots artists, because they have the least amount of time and they have the least amount of money. So if you are working as a digital content creator in the games industry, you can probably make a business case for having that space, and you might not need me. But if you are a printmaker and you've got equipment that you need to buy, if you are an illustrator or a visual artist or a dancer, it's much more complicated. If you don't have an obvious revenue stream, it's really difficult. So there's maybe a difference between what the universities are interested in and what individual academics are interested in. But I would hope that universities feel that they have a responsibility to the ecosystem that we are a part of. And my students become my colleagues. And I don't want to see them moving and lugging, spending 2 weeks when they could be doing a really fantastic exhibition proposal or working on their practice, lugging bags out of a door again. And I think you were talking before about the waste that's involved in that. But also we found in our research that artists start to place mental blocks when they get close to that lease coming up. So even if you've got, you said you were supposed to be in there for 18 months or something at the beginning. But when you get close, when you get to 10, you're already in your head like, I've got to turn that work down. I can't do that. I can't invest in that. I'm not going to have that conversation with somebody that might lead to something because there's no point, because we're going. And I think artists the blocks come down really quite quickly. And it, even without thinking about it, it limits what happens. It limits the kind of potential of places. And that is what we have been working to stop and to try and say, actually, if you give people more time, and you give them that stability, then they will be able to provide those things that are really important in a community, like the safety. And really fascinating that you can start with safety and end up at workspace. But give people that sense that something is theirs, and all this other stuff will then come. But they have to have the security, and they have to have somebody to advocate for that. And they're so, as a group, artists are really under-resourced, and they don't have many champions or many spaces. And maybe that's something that you are doing in York, is creating that sense of momentum so that somebody can champion that. And the really good example from Newcastle is we have a North East Cultural Freelancers Facebook group. I mean, it's a Facebook group. But suddenly, there was somebody, a single person, to ask to come to represent freelancers. And within a year, 18 months, freelancers were in every bit of art policy in a way that they had never been before. Because how do you get every freelancer out of their kitchen? Lots of people are working from home. If you went to every space in the city, you've got like 35 in your book. That's 35 people to get around a table. But having someone in charge of a Facebook group meant that went right up the agenda, because she was at the table talking over and over again, saying, what about freelancers? What about freelancers? What about freelancers?
And that beautifully segues into, not embarrassing Ben Porter at the back, but obviously your creatives set up as a Facebook group, and there is momentum in the city and continues to be.
I think they are so powerful, and a real tool for advocacy. And
I think that's, multiple stakeholders in this room included are creating an ongoing groundswell. There is work to be done, and I'm not sure, I'm looking at the back about time, but there is that ongoing groundswell around how can we really go up a notch. And I don't mean that necessarily recreating Pica, or, because we have Pica. We have fabrication. It's not losing these spaces. It's giving opportunities to others, making similar spaces, but they work, and there's collaboration between York Central and the city centre of York that people know and understand, but it's walkable. It overlaps into gig spaces where people can do acoustic, sets, louder sets. But we've got a white cube gallery, for example, that we can host all sorts of things, from digital, technological, amazing things, right down to beautifully sewn fabric pieces, or jewellery, buttons. So I think that there is work to be done, and we are all here to continue that work, to lobby, to keep people invested in the sectors, because it is not just one sector. I am passionate about this. It's a crossover of sectors, and I am more of the clean end of this when we talk about creative makers, but I produce work and it has an impact and is involved in the city, and it's not always about the work that I do personally, but my team. One of my team is a studio manager, as her admin job, as it were, but she's an artist. She's she's a painter. So there's lots of crossovers, and she does both really, 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 really well. In terms of Q&A, I think it might be a good 5 minutes. Thank you, John. If we can open it up to the floor. If there's any burning questions, at least one, good. And if you guys are happy to, if you're happy to direct the questions, we'll try and get some good answers.
Can I just do one little bit?
You can.
It's just something we found. One of the things so I said earlier, we did when we moved into number 24 on Coney Street, little old timber frame. It looks old. It doesn't look as old as it is. It's been modernised in 1740. We started this Coney Street Heritage Project, and we didn't know the numbering system, so we found that there was a tinsmith and coppersmith in the building. They were WH Smiths, but we managed to get a Heritage Lottery grant on the fact that we discovered red list crafts, heritage crafts on Coney Street. And with the project we did, we only went up to 1900 when it changed into a modern street. So Boots had moved in, things changed. But pretty much I would say 75% of the shops on Coney Street were creative shops. There were woodworkers where Card Factory is, and gilders that made things for Newby Hall, and and where Smiths is. That's where the assay office was used, and the tokens for York, and the jewellers were in all those buildings down the street. And they found a print press where they've just done the new holiday lets on the street, the old Swarovski shop. They found the printing press in the shed in the garden from the 18th century. So that was on the high street in York. All these creators going back centuries. The building, we think that the building we were in, there were always shops below, and there was a candle maker, and there was a shoemaker, and that Margaret Clitheroe's father had his shop there. So these people were making creatively back in the 12th, 13th, 14th, until the beginning of the 20th century on Coney Street. And that was one of the most fascinating things. As I said, we got some funding because of that. And we ran heritage crafts workshops based on those skills on the street.
And that's proof, I think, that it's still as relevant now that we have the makers and creators within the city's fabric.
What we wanted to match exactly what we were doing on Coney Street still existed and had done, from the bra shop to the shoemakers to the sweet shop to everything still exists on the street.
Yep.
You just pull it forward, and there's no reason why that can't happen with upstairs spaces and everything. Everything we look for is, we go, it's not got enough upstairs, we want an upstairs space, we need a back door for out of hours, that kind of stuff.
That's a really good point. Thank you, Dolly. Thank you.